Alvaron looked to Maelowin, but she shook her head firmly. I will not have this spoken of to strangers. The mayor seemed disappointed by this answer, but didn't press the point. Instead, he turned back to me. Let me ask you your own questions back again. What sort of wood is it? It's lasted 3,000 years, I mused aloud. It's heavy despite being hollow, so it has to be a slow wood, like hornbeam or a rennel. Its color and weight make me think it has a good deal of metal in it too, like roa. Probably iron and copper, I shrugged. That's the best I can do. What's inside it? I thought for a long moment before saying anything. Something smaller than a salt box, I began. Maelowin smiled, but Alvaron gave the barest of frowns, so I hurried on. Something metal, by the way the weight shifts when I tilt it. I closed my eyes and listened to the padded thump of its contents moving in the box. No. By the weight of it, perhaps something made of glass or stone. Something precious, Alvaron said. I opened my eyes. Not necessarily. It has become precious because it is old, and because it has been with the family for so long. It is also precious because it is a mystery. But was it precious to begin with? I shrugged. Who can say? But you lock up precious things, Alvaron pointed out. Precisely. I held up the box, displaying its smooth face.
I'm probably just going to grab a 3X.
This isn't locked up. In fact, it might be locked away. It may be something dangerous. Why would you say that? Alvaron asked curiously. Why go through this trouble? Maelowin protested. Why save something dangerous? If something is dangerous, you destroy it. She seemed to answer her own question as soon as she had voiced it. Unless it was precious as well as dangerous. Perhaps it was too useful to destroy, Alvaron suggested. Perhaps it couldn't be destroyed, I said.
I can carry one.
Last and best, Alvaron said, leaning forward even further in his seat. How do you open it? I gave the box a long look, turned it in my hands, pressed the sides. I ran my fingers over the patterns, feeling for a seam my eyes could not detect. I shook it gently, tasted the air around it, held it to the light. I have no idea, I admitted. Alvaron slumped a little. It was too much to expect, I suppose. Perhaps some piece of magic? I hesitated to tell him that sort of magic only existed in stories. None I have at my command. Have you ever considered simply cutting it open? Alvaron asked his wife. Maelowin looked every bit as horrified as I felt at the suggestion. Never, she said as soon as she caught her breath. It is the very root of our family. I would sooner think of salting every acre of our lands. And hard as this wood is, I hurried to say, you would most likely ruin whatever was inside, especially if it is delicate. It was only a thought, Alvaron reassured his wife. An ill-considered one, Maelowin said sharply, then seemed to regret her words. I'm sorry, but the very thought... She trailed off, obviously distraught. He patted her hand. I understand, my dear. You're right. It was ill-considered. Might I put it away now? Maelowin asked him. I reluctantly handed the box back to Maelowin. If there were a lock, I could attempt to circumvent it, but I can't even make a guess at where the hinge might be, or the seam for the lid. In a box, no lid or locks. Lackless keeps her husband's rocks. The child's skipping rhyme ran madly through my head, and I only barely managed to turn my laugh into a cough. Alvaron didn't seem to notice. As always, I trust to your discretion. He got to his feet. Unfortunately, I fear I have used up the better portion of our time. I'm certain you have other matters to attend to. Shall we meet tomorrow to discuss the Emir? Second bell? I had risen to my feet with the mayor. If it please your grace, I have another matter that warrants some discussion. He gave me a serious look. I trust this is an important matter. Most urgent, your grace, I said nervously. It should not wait another day. I would have mentioned it sooner, had we both privacy and time. Very well. He sat back down. What presses you so direly? Leyrand, Maelowin said with slight reproach. It is past the hour. Hyannis will be waiting. Let him wait, he said. Kvothe has served me well in all regards. He does nothing lightly, and I ignore him only to my detriment. You flatter me, Your Grace. This matter is a grave one. I glanced at Maelowin, and somewhat delicate as well. If your lady desires to leave, it might be for the best.
Yeah, they're just chilling there.
If the matter is important, should I not stay? She asked archly. I gave the mayor a questioning look. Anything you wish to say to me, you can tell my lady wife, he said. I hesitated. I needed to tell Alvaron about the false troopers soon. I was sure if he heard my version of events first, I could present them in a way that cast me in a favorable light. If word came through official channels first, he might not be willing to overlook the bald facts of the situation, that I had slaughtered 9 travelers of my own free will. Despite that, the last thing I wanted was Maelowin present for the conversation. It couldn't help but complicate the situation. I tried one final time. It is a matter most dark, Your Grace. Alvaron shook his head, frowning slightly. We have no secrets. I fought down a resigned sigh and drew a thick piece of folded parchment from an inner pocket of my shade. Is this one of the writs of patronage Your Grace has granted? His eyes flickered over it, showing some surprise. Yes. How did you come by it? Oh, Leyrand, Maelowin said. I knew you let the beggars travel in your lands, but I never thought you would stoop to patronizing them as well. Only a handful of troops, he said, as befitting my rank. Every respectable household has at least a few players. Mine, Maelowin said firmly, does not. It is convenient to have one's own troop, Alvaron said gently, and more convenient to have several. Then one can choose the proper entertainment to accompany whatever event you might be hosting. Where do you think the musicians at our wedding came from? When Maelowin's expression did not soften, Alvaron continued. They are not permitted to perform anything bawdy or heathen, dear. I keep them under most close controlment, and rest assured, no town in my lands would let a troop perform unless they had a noble's writ with them. Alvaron turned back to me. Which brings us back to the matter at hand. How did you come to have their writ? The troop must be doing poorly without it. I hesitated. With Maelowin here, I was unsure as to the best way to approach the subject. I'd planned on speaking to the mayor alone. They are, Your Grace. They were killed. The mayor showed no surprise. I thought as much. Such things are unfortunate, but they happen from time to time. Maelowin's eyes flashed. I'd give a great deal to see them happen more often. Have you any idea who killed them? The mayor asked. In a certain manner of speaking, Your Grace.
Right here.
He raised his eyebrows expectantly.
20th place teams in
Well
there.
then? I did. You did what? I sighed. I killed the men carrying that writ, Your Grace. He stiffened in his seat. What? They had kidnapped a pair of girls from a town they passed through. I paused, looking for a delicate way of saying it in front of Maelowin. They were young girls, Your Grace, and the men were not kind to them. Maelowin's expression, already hard, grew cold as ice at this. But before she could speak, Alvaron demanded incredulously, And you took it on yourself to kill them? An entire troop of performers I had given license to? He rubbed his forehead. How many were there? 9. Good Lord!
Solo Velko.
I think he did right,
And checkpoint.
Maelowin said hotly.
Grab that crate.
I say you give him a score of guards and let him do the same to every rabble band of Rue he finds within your lands. My dear, Alvaron said with a touch of sternness,
Hasn't even come down yet.
I don't care for them much more than you, but law is law. When law is what you make it, she interjected. This man has done you a noble service. You should grant him fief and title and set him on your council. He killed 9 of my subjects, Alvaron pointed out sternly. When men step outside the rule of law, anarchy results. If I heard of this in passing, I would hang him for a bandit. He killed 9 Rue rapists, 9 murdering rabble thieves. 9 fewer Edema men in the world is a service to us all. Maelowin looked at me. Sir, I think you did nothing but what was right and proper.
What do you mean? They're just gonna
Her misdirected praise did nothing but fan the fire beneath my temper.
Oh, yeah.
Not all of them were men, my lady, I said to her.
They're just gonna go checkpoint.
Maelowin paled a bit at that remark. Alvaron rubbed his face with a hand. Good Lord, man, your honesty is like a felling axe. And I should mention, I said seriously, begging both your pardons, that those I killed were not Edema Rue. They were not even a real troop. Alvaron shook his head tiredly and tapped the writ in front of him. It says here otherwise. Edema Rue and troopers both. The writ was stolen goods, your grace. The folk I met on the road had killed a troop of Rue and taken up their place. He gave me a curious look. You seem rather certain of it. One of them told me so, your grace. He admitted they were merely impersonating a troop. They were pretending to be Rue. Maelowin looked as if she couldn't decide whether she was confused or sickened by the thought. Who would pretend such a thing? Alvaron nodded. My wife makes a point, he said. It seems more likely that they lied to you. Who wouldn't deny such a thing? Who would willingly admit to being one of the Edema Rue? I felt myself flush hot at this, suddenly ashamed that I had concealed my Edema Rue blood for all this time.
They're fighting.
I don't doubt your original troop were Edema Rue, your grace, but the men I killed were not. No Rue would do the things they did. Maelowin's eyes flashed furiously. You do not know them. I met her eyes. My lady, I think I know them rather well. But why? Alvaron asked. Who in their right mind would try to pass themselves off as Edema Rue? For ease of travel, I said, and the protection your name offers. He shrugged my explanation away. They were probably Rue that tired of honest work and took up thieving instead. No, your grace, I insisted. They were not Edema Rue. Alvaron gave me a reproachful look. Come now. Who can tell the difference between bandits and a band of Rue? There is no difference, Maelowin said crisply. Your grace, I would know the difference, I said hotly. I am Edema Rue. Silence. Maelowin's expression turned from blank shock to disbelief to rage to disgust. She came to her feet, looked for a moment as if she would spit on me, then walked stiffly out the door. There was a clatter as her personal guard came to attention and followed her out of the outer rooms. Alvaron continued to look at me, his face severe. If this is a joke, it is a poor one.
I can't die.
It is none, your grace, I said, wrestling with my temper. And why have you found it necessary to hide this from me? I have not hidden it, your grace. You yourself have mentioned several times that I am far from gentle birth. He struck the arm of his chair angrily. You know what I mean! Why did you never mention that you were one of the Rue? I think the reason rather obvious, your grace, I said stiffly, trying to keep from spitting out the words. The words Edema Rue have too strong a smell for many gentle noses.
It is.
Your wife has found her perfume cannot cover it. My lady has had unfortunate dealings with the Rue in the past, he said by way of explanation. You would do well to note.
I
know of her sister, her family's tragic shame. Run off and love a trooper. How terrible, I said scathingly, my entire body prickling with hot rage.
I'm safe.
Her sister's sense does credit to her family, less so the actions of your lady wife. My blood is worth as much as any man's, and more than most. And even were it not, she has no leave to treat me as she did. Alvaron's expression hardened. I rather think that she has leave to treat you as she will, he said. She was simply startled by your sudden proclamation.
Alright. I'm about to just
Given
go
her
underneath.
feelings about
I'm
you,
going underneath.
Rabble,
I'm going underneath.
I think she showed remarkable restraint. I
might
think
drop
she
on
rused
us.
the truth. A trooper's tongue has gotten her to bed more quickly than her sister.
Is it
As
ISO?
soon as I
Is
said
this
it,
an ISO
I
fight?
knew I had gone too far. I clenched my teeth to keep from
This is an
saying
ISO
anything
fight. We
worse.
could take this 3v.
That will be
You
all,
up.
Alvaron said with cold formality, his eyes flat and angry. I left with all the angry dignity I could muster. Not because I had nothing else to say, but because if I had stayed one moment longer, he would have called for guards, and that is not how I wish to make my exit.
Yeah, we can.
Chapter 140, Just Rewards. I was in the middle of dressing the following morning when an errand boy arrived bearing a thick envelope with Alvaron's seal. I took a seat by the window and discovered several letters inside. The outermost one read, Quoth, I have thought a while and decided your blood matters but little in light of the services you have rendered me. However, my soul
There's
is
a guy
bound to
standing
another
still right
whose
there.
comfort I hold more dearly than my own. Though I had hoped to retain your services, I cannot. What's more, as your presence is the cause of my wife's considerable distress, I must ask you to return my ring and leave Severin at your earliest convenience. I stopped reading, got to my feet, and opened the door to my rooms. A pair of Alvaron's guards were standing at attention in the hallway. Sir? One of them said, eyeing my half-dressed state. Just checking, I said, closing the door.
150.
I returned to my seat and picked up the letter again. As to the matter that precipitated this unfortunate circumstance, I believe you have acted in the best interest of myself and Ventus as a whole. In fact, I have received report just this morning that 2 girls were returned to their families in Levenshire by a red-haired gentleman named Quoth. As reward for your many services, I offer the following.
As well.
First, a full pardon for those you killed near Levenshire. Second, a letter of credit enabling you to draw on my coffers for the payment of your tuition at the university.
They put
Third,
a fence through the door,
a
'cause I
writ
could just sit
granting
on
you
that
the
door.
right to travel, play, and perform wherever you will within my lands. Lastly, my thanks. Marshon Lerend Alvaron. I sat for a few long minutes, watching the birds flit in the garden outside my window. The contents of the envelope were just as Alvaron had said. The letter of credit was a work of art, signed and sealed in 4 places by Alvaron and his chief exchequer. The writ was, if anything, even more lovely. It was drawn on a thick sheet of creamy vellum, signed by the mayor's own hand and fixed with both his family's seal and that of Alvaron himself. But it was not a writ of patronage. I read through it carefully. By omission, it made it clear that neither was I in the mayor's service, nor were we bound to each other. Still, it granted me free travel and the right to perform under his name. It was an odd compromise of a document.
Just keep crawling.
I just finished dressing when there came another knock on the door. I sighed, half expecting more guards coming to roust me out of my rooms.
I just got swung for free.
But opening the door,
Alone.
I revealed another
Keep from
runner
the roof.
boy. He carried a silver tray bearing another letter.
Yeah,
This
it looked
one
like you
had the
were gonna queue up
lackless
in the
seal
open.
upon the top. Beside it lay a ring. I picked it up and turned it
I mean,
over
our
in
spot
my
was gonna be
hands,
the best,
puzzled.
too. We were gonna get 6 free
It wasn't
KP, or
iron, as I'd
We're
expected,
gonna get a shit
but
ton of
pale
free KP
wood.
there.
Malouin's name was burned crudely into the side of it. I noticed the runner boy's wide eyes darting back and forth between the ring and myself. More importantly, I noticed the guards were not staring at it. Pointedly not staring. The sort of not staring you only engage in when something very interesting has come to your attention. I handed the boy my silver ring. "Take this to Braden," I said, "and don't dawdle." Braden was looking up at the guards as I opened the door. "Keep up the good work, my boys," he said playfully, tapping one of them on the chest with his walking stick. The silver wolf's head chimed lightly against the guard's breastplate, and Braden smiled like a jolly uncle. "We all feel safer for your vigilance."
Oh my god.
He closed the door behind himself and raised an eyebrow at me. "Lord's mercy, boy. You're up the ladder by leaps and bounds. I knew you sat solid in the mayor's good grace, but to have him assign you 2 of his personal guard..." He pressed his hand to his heart and sighed dramatically. Soon you will be too busy for the likes of poor old useless Braden. I gave him a weak smile. I think it's more complicated than that. I held up the wooden ring for him to see. I need you to tell me what this means. Braden's jovial cheer evaporated more quickly than if I'd pulled out a bloody knife. Lord and lady, he said. Tell me you got that from some old-fashioned farmer. I shook my head and handed it to him.
Second place isn't bad.
He turned the ring over in his hands. Maelowin?
Like 200 each?
He asked quietly. Handing it back, he sank into a nearby chair, his walking stick across his knees. His face had gone slightly gray.
Yeah, it's 600.
The mayor's new lady wife sent you this? As a summons? It's about as far from a summons as anything can be, I said. She sent a charming letter, too. I held it up with my other hand. Braden held out his hand.
It's a good day.
Can I see it?
Really good.
He asked, then drew his hand back quickly. I'm sorry. That's terribly rude of me to ask. You could do me no greater favor than reading it, I said, pressing it into his hands. I am in desperate need of your opinion. Braden took the letter and began to read, his lips moving slightly. His expression grew paler as he made his way down the page.
I thought about that now, but in the moment I was just like...
The lady has a gift for well-turned phrase, I said.
You guys want to just like...
That cannot be denied, he said. She might as well have written this in blood.
And if we wait
I think she would have liked to, I said, but she would have to kill herself to fill the second page. I held it out to him.
Well, I'm done, Ed.
Braden took it and continued to read, his face growing even paler. Gods all around us, he said. Is excrescence even a word? He asked. It is, I said. Braden finished the second page, then went back to the beginning and slowly read it through a second time. Finally, he looked up at me. If there were a woman, he said, who loved me with 1/10 the passion this lady feels for you, I would count myself the luckiest of men. What does this mean? I asked, holding up the ring. I could smell smoke on it. She must have burned her name into it just this morning. From a farmer? He shrugged. Many things, depending on the wood. But here, from one of the nobility. He shook his head, obviously at a loss for words. I thought there were only 3 types of courtly rings, I said. Only 3 a person would use, he said. Only 3 that are sent and displayed. It used to be you sent wooden rings to summon servants, those too low for iron. But that was a long while back. Eventually it became a terrible snub to send someone in the court a wooden ring. A snub I can live with, I said, relieved. I've been snubbed by better folk than her. That was 100 years ago, Braden said. Things have changed. The problem was, once the wooden rings were seen as a snub, some servants would be offended by them. You don't want to offend the master of your stables, so you don't send him a wooden ring. But if he doesn't get a wooden ring, then your tailor might be offended by one. I nodded my understanding. And so on. Eventually everyone was offended by a wooden ring. Braden nodded. A wise man is careful to stay on the good side of his servants, he said. Even the boy that brings your dinner can carry a grudge, and there are 1,000 invisible revengers available to the lowest of them. Wooden rings aren't used at all anymore. They probably would have fallen out of memory entirely if they weren't used as a plot device in a handful of plays. I looked at the ring. So I'm lower than the boy who collects the slops. Braden cleared his throat self-consciously. More than that, actually. He pointed. That means to her, you aren't even a person. You aren't worth recognizing as a human being. Ah, I said.
What is that head glitch that he was just
sitting
on?
I slid the wooden ring onto my finger and made a fist. It was quite a good fit, actually. It's not the sort of ring you wear, Braden said uncomfortably. It's quite the other sort of ring, actually. He gave me a curious look. I don't suppose you still have Alvaron's ring? He asked for it back, actually. I picked the mayor's letter off the table and handed it to Braden as well.
I need to be good today.
At your earliest convenience, Braden quoted with a dry chuckle. That says quite a bit more than it seems. He set the letter down.
I'm playing
Still,
Renegades today.
It's probably better this way. If he left you with his favor, you'd be a battleground for them. A peppercorn between her mortar and his pestle. They would crush you with their bickering. His eyes flickered back to the wooden ring on my hand. I don't suppose she gave it to you personally? He asked hopefully.
What's up, Eglav?
She sent it with a runner. I let out a low sigh. The guards saw it too. There was a knock on the door.
What's up,
I
Nelson?
answered it, and a runner boy handed me a letter.
What's up, Culture?
I closed the door and looked at the seal.
I know. All I know
Lord
is that they
Pravek,
want me to
I said.
play ranked with them.
Braden shook his head.
1 p.m.
I swear that man spends every waking moment with his ear against a keyhole or his tongue up someone's ass. Chuckling,
One way or another,
I
I'll be
cracked
there.
the letter open and scanned it quickly. He's asking for his ring back, I said. It's smudged, too. He didn't even wait for the ink to dry. Braden nodded. Word is undoubtedly
RNG
spreading.
I am today.
It wouldn't be so bad if she wasn't sitting strong at Alberon's right hand. But she is, and she's made her opinion clear. Anyone who treats you better than a dog will doubtless share the scorn she feels for you. He fluttered her letter. And scorn such as this, there's plenty to go around without worry of it spreading thin. Braden gestured to the bowl of rings and gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. Just when you were getting some silver, too. I walked over to the bowl, dug out his ring, and held it out to him. You should take this back, I said. Braden's expression looked pained, but he made no move to take the ring. I'm going to be leaving soon, I said, and I'd hate for you to be tarnished by your contact with me. There's no way I can thank you for the help you've given me. The least I can do is help minimize the damage to your reputation. Braden hesitated, then closed his eyes and sighed.
Yeah, not really.
He took the ring with a defeated shrug.
Called me an idiot? No, I didn't.
Oh, I said, suddenly remembering something else. I went to the stack of slanderous stories and pulled out the pages that described his pagan frolics. You might find this amusing, I said as I handed it to him. Now you should probably go.
See, I didn't even know that.
Simply being here can't be good for you. Braden sighed and nodded.
Okay, wait, hold up.
I'm sorry it didn't work out better for you, my boy.
Mail's
If you're ever back in these parts, don't hesitate to call on me. These things do blow over eventually. His eyes kept drifting back to the wooden ring on my finger. You really shouldn't keep wearing that. After he was gone, I fished Stapes' gold ring out of the bowl and Alberon's iron one as well. Then, I stepped out into the hallway. I'm going to pay a call on Stapes, I said politely to the guards. Would the two of you care to accompany me? The taller one glanced at the ring on my finger, then looked at his companion before murmuring in agreement. I turned on my heel and set off, my escort keeping pace behind me.
So, I don't know, and I was farming.
Stapes ushered me inside his sitting room and closed the door behind me. His rooms were even finer than my own and considerably more lived in. I also saw a large bowl of rings on a nearby table. All of them were gold. The only iron ring in sight was Alberon's, and that was on his finger. He might look like a grocer, but Stapes had a sharp set of eyes. He spotted the ring on my finger straight away. She did it then, he said, shaking his head. You really shouldn't wear it. I'm not ashamed of what I am, I said. If this is the ring of an Edema Rue, I'll wear it. Stapes sighed. It's more complicated than that. I know, I said. I didn't come here to make your life difficult. Could you return this to the mayor for me? I handed him Alberon's ring. Stapes put it in his pocket. I also wanted to return these. I handed him the 2 rings he had given me. One bright gold, one white bone.
RNG today.
I don't want to make trouble between you and your master's new wife. Stapes nodded, holding up the gold ring. It would make trouble if you kept it, he said. I am in the mayor's service. As such,
Oh my
I need
God,
to
dude.
be mindful of the games of the court. Then he reached out and took my hand, pressing the bone ring
I
back
can't
into it.
hear anything because I'm
But
blasting
this
music.
lies outside my duty to the mayor. It is a debt between two men. The games of the court have no sway over such things. Stapes met my eye.
Okay, that's
And
a
I
banger.
insist
That's a banger. That's a banger.
you
That's a
keep
banger.
it.
That's a banger. That's a banger. That's a banger.
I ate a late supper alone in my rooms. The guards were still waiting patiently outside as I read the mayor's letter for the 5th time. Each time I hoped to find some clement
playing a Renegade
sentiment
today.
hidden in his phrasing, but it simply wasn't there. On the table sat the various
Darko?
papers the mayor had sent. I emptied my purse beside them. I had 2 gold royals, 4 silver nobles, 8.5 pennies, and, inexplicably, a single Modegan strelum, though I couldn't for the life of me remember where I'd come by it. Altogether, they equaled slightly less than 8 talents. I stacked them next to Alvaron's papers. 8 talents, a pardon, a player's writ, and my tuition paid at the university. It was not an inconsiderable reward.
Changed.
Still, I couldn't help but feel rather shorted. I had saved
Well, they
Alvaron
usually
from a
14
poisoning,
months by
uncovered a
time.
traitor in his court, won him a wife, and rid his roads of more dangerous folk than I cared to count. Despite all that, I was still left without a patron. Worse, his letter had made no mention of the Emir, no mention of the support he had promised to lend me in my search for them. But there was nothing to be gained by making a fuss, and much that I could lose. I refilled my purse and tucked Alvaron's letters into the secret compartment in my loot case. I also nicked 3 books I'd brought from Codicus's library, since no one knew I had them, and tipped the bowl full of rings into a small sack.
Yeah, that's
The
how game
wardrobe
should
held
work.
24 finely tailored outfits. They were worth a heavy penny, but weren't very portable.
Hello?
I took 2 of the nicer outfits and left the rest hanging. Lastly, I belted on Susura and worked my shade into a long cape. Those 2 items reassured me that my time in Ventus had not been entirely
Yeah,
wasted,
I just used the,
though I'd earned them on my own,
colorblind.
not through any help of Alvaron's. I locked the door, snuffed the lamps,
how, like,
and
the
climbed out a
white is,
window
like,
into the
black.
garden. Then I used
I
a
like
piece
about
of
it.
bent wire to lock the window and close the shutters behind me. Petty mischief? Perhaps, but I'd be damned if I'd be escorted from the estates by the mayor's guard. Besides, the thought of them puzzling over my escape made me chuckle, and laughter is good for the digestion. I made my way out of the estates without anyone seeing me. My shade was well suited to sneaking about in the dark. After an hour of searching, I found a greasy bookbinder in Severin Low. He was an unsavory fellow with the morals of a feral dog, but he was interested in the stack of slanderous stories the nobility had been sending to my rooms. He offered me 4 reals for the lot of them, plus the promise of 10 pennies for every volume of the book he sold after they were printed. I bargained him up to 6 reals and 6 pennies per copy, and we shook hands. I left his shop, burned the contract, and washed my hands twice. I did keep the money, however. After that, I sold both suits of fine clothing and all of Codicus's books, except for one. With the money I'd accumulated, I spent the next several hours on the docks and found a ship leaving the next day for Junpui.
You know what I mean?
As night settled onto the city, I wandered the high parts of Severin, hoping I might run into Denna.
God damn.
I didn't, of course. I could tell she was long gone.
The first person to,
A city feels different when Denna is somewhere inside it, and Severin felt as hollow as an empty egg.
Badge. Month and a half one.
At the end of several hours of fruitless searching, I stopped by a dockside brothel and spent some time drinking in the tap room.
Really?
It was a slow night, and the ladies
Really?
were bored. So I bought drinks for everyone, and we talked. I told a few stories, and they listened. I played a
Did you
few
go to a
songs,
streamer who's
and they
live?
applauded. Then I asked a favor,
Ask for
and they
tips
laughed and
on
laughed and
streaming.
laughed. So I
You don't see a
poured
problem
the
with that?
sack full of rings into a bowl and left them on the bar.
No self-promo.
Soon, the ladies
Good
were
work.
trying them on and arguing over who would get the silver ones. I bought another round of drinks and left. My mood somewhat improved.
Now, thanks so much for the 100 bits.
I wandered aimlessly after that, eventually finding a small public garden near the lip of the sheer looking out over Severin Low. The lamps below were burning orange, while here or there a gaslight or sympathy lamp flickered greenish blue and crimson. It was as breathtaking as the first time I had seen it. I had been watching for some time before I realized I wasn't alone. An older man leaned against a tree several feet away, looking down at the lights much as I had been. A faint and not unpleasant aroma of beer wafted from him. "She's a pretty thing, isn't she?" he said, his accent marking him as a dock worker. I agreed. We watched the twinkling fires silently for a time. I unscrewed the wooden ring from my finger and considered throwing it off the cliff. Now that someone was watching, I couldn't help but feel the gesture was somewhat childish. "They say a nobleman can piss on half a sovereign from up here," the dock man said conversationally.
People come in, they'll be like,
I tucked the ring into a pocket of my shade.
My bad, I'm gonna go start
A memento, then.
Like,
"Those are the lazy ones," I replied. "The ones I've met can piss a lot further than that."
Exactly what they're doing. And they try to play it off like innocent.
Chapter 141.
But I didn't
A
mean
Journey to
like,
Return.
you know?
Fate favored me on the way back
Don't
to
be
the
mad at me, I
university.
didn't mean to
We had a
be
good
like,
win,
you know, I
and
didn't
everything
mean
was
to do that.
delightfully uneventful. The sailors had heard of my encounter with Felurian, so I enjoyed a modest fame for the duration of the trip. I played them the song I had written about it, and told them the story about half as often as they asked me to. I also told them about my trip to the Adem. They didn't believe a piece of it at first, but then I showed them the sword, and threw their best wrestler 3 times. They showed me a different sort of respect after that, and a rougher, more honest sort of friendship. I learned a goodly bit from them on my journey home. They told me sea stories and the names of stars. They talked about wind, water, and women. Sorry, women. They tried to teach me sailor's knots, but I didn't have a knack for it, though I proved to be a dab hand at untying them. Altogether, it was very pleasant. The friendship of the sailors, the song of the wind in the rigging, the smell of sweat and salt and tar. Over the long days, these things slowly eased the bitterness I felt toward my ill treatment at the hands of Mayor Alvaron and his loving lady wife. Chapter 142. Home.
So, kids?
Eventually, we docked in Tarbean, where the sailors helped me find a cheap berth on a billow boat heading upstream toward Annalyn. I got off 2 days later in Imre and walked to the university just as the first blue light of dawn was coloring the sky. I've never in my life had anything like a home. As a young child, I grew up on the road, endlessly traveling with my troop. Home wasn't a place. It was people and wagons. Later in Tarbean, I had had a secret place where 3 roofs came together and gave me shelter from the rain. I slept there and hid a few precious things, but it wasn't anything like a home. Because of this, I'd never in my life enjoyed the feeling of coming home after a journey. I felt it for the first time that day as I crossed the Omethi, the stones of the bridge familiar underneath my feet. As I came to the tallest part of its broad arch, I could see the gray shape of the archives rising out of the trees ahead of me. The streets of the university were comforting under my feet. I'd been gone for 3/4 of a year. In some ways, it seemed much longer, but at the same time, everything here felt so familiar that it felt like hardly any time at all had passed. It was still early when I got to Anchors, and the front door was locked. I briefly considered climbing up to my window, then thought better of it, given that I was carrying my loot case and travel sack, and wearing Sasura as well. Instead, I made my way to the Mews and knocked on Simmons' door. It was early, and I knew I'd be waking him, but I was hungry for a familiar face. After waiting a short minute and hearing nothing, I knocked again, louder, and practiced my best jaunty smile.
No passion? That's what I'm saying.
Sim opened the door, his hair in disarray, his eyes red from too little sleep. He looked blearily out at me. For the space of a breath, his expression was blank. Then, he hurled himself at me with a crushing hug. "Blackened body of God!" he said, using stronger language than I'd ever heard from him before. "Kvothe! You're alive!" Sim had a bit of a cry, then shouted at me for a while, and then we laughed and sorted matters out. It seems Threp had been keeping closer tabs on my travels than I'd thought. Consequently, when my ship had gone missing, he'd assumed the worst. A letter would have cleared things up, but I'd never thought to send one. The thought of writing home was utterly alien to me.
My favorite weapon combo.
The ship was reported as all hands lost, Sim said. Word spread around the Aeolian, and guess who heard the news? Stanchion? I asked, knowing he was a terrible gossip. Sim shook his head grimly. Ambrose. Oh, lovely, I observed dryly. It would have been bad coming from anyone, Sim said.
Wait, what?
But it was worst from him. I was half convinced he'd somehow arranged to sink your ship. He gave a sickly smile. He waited until right before admissions before he broke the news to me. Needless to say, I pissed all over myself during my exam and spent another term as an Elir.
That's weird.
Spent? I said. You made Relar? He grinned. Just yesterday. I was sleeping off the celebration when you woke me up this morning.
Sorry.
How's Will? I asked. Did he take the news hard? Even keeled as always, Sim said. But for all that, yeah, pretty hard. He grimaced. Ambrose has been making his life difficult in the archives, too. Will got fed up with it and went home for a term. He should be back today. How's everyone else? I asked.
I'm not on a team.
A thought seemed to strike Sim all of a sudden. He stood up.
Banger, bro.
Oh, God, fella! Then he sat down hard, as if his legs had been cut from underneath him. Oh, God, fella! He said in a completely different tone.
Hey.
What? I asked.
You
Did something happen to her?
I don't even know you.
She didn't take the news well either. He gave me a shaky smile. It turns out she had quite a thing for you. Bella? I said stupidly. Don't you remember? Will and I thought she liked you. It seemed like years ago.
No,
I remember.
I'm so bad.
Sim seemed uncomfortable.
The song blows? Nobody fucking cares about you,
see, while you were gone, Will and I started spending a lot of time with her, and... He made an inarticulate gesture. His expression was stuck between sheepish and grinning.
What's up, Ian?
Realization struck.
RNG?
You and fella? Sim, that's great! I felt a grin spread across my face, then saw his expression. Oh. My grin fell away. Sim, I wouldn't get in the way of that. I know you wouldn't. He smiled a sickly smile. I trust you. I rubbed my eyes. This is a hell of a homecoming. I haven't even been through admissions yet. Today's the last day, Sim pointed out. I know, I said, getting to my feet. I have an errand to run first.
I'm not on a team, Edge.
I left my baggage in Simmons' room and paid a visit to the bursar in the basement of Hollows. Reem was a balding, pinch-faced man who had disliked me ever since the masters had assigned me a negative tuition in my first term. He wasn't in the habit of giving money out, and the entire experience had rubbed him the wrong way.
Except for the exception of
I showed him my open letter of credit to Alvaron's coffers. As I've said, it was an impressive document, signed by the mayor's own hand, wax seals, fine vellum, excellent penmanship. I drew the bursar's attention to the fact that the mayor's letter would allow the university to draw any amount needed to cover my tuition. Any amount.
You don't even have to be
The bursar read it over and agreed that seemed to be the case.
You just have to know, like,
It's too bad my tuition was always so low, I mused aloud. Never more than 10 talents. It was a bit of a missed opportunity for the university. The mayor was richer than the king of Vint, after all, and he would pay any tuition. Reem was a savvy man, and he understood what I was hinting at immediately. There followed a brief bout of negotiation, after which we shook hands and I saw him smile for the first time.
That's all you have to do. You just have
I grabbed a bite of lunch, then waited in line with the rest of the students who didn't have admissions tiles. Most of them were new students, but a few were applying for readmission like myself. It was a long line, and everyone was visibly nervous to some degree. I whistled to pass the time, and bought a meat pie and a mug of hot cider from a man with a cart.
You would probably still say to that.
I caused a bit of a stir when I stepped into the circle of light in front of the master's table. They had heard the news and were surprised to see me alive, most of them pleasantly so. Kilvin demanded I report to the workshop soon, while Mandrag, Dahl, and Arwyll argued over which courses of study I would pursue.
From behind.
Elodin merely waved at me, the only one apparently unimpressed by my miraculous return from the dead.
Everybody's playing in this tournament.
After a minute of congenial chaos, the Chancellor got things back under control and started my interview. I answered Dahl's questions easily enough, and Kilvin's, but I fumbled my cipher with Brandur, then had to admit I simply didn't know the answer to Mandrag's question about sublimation. Ilodin shrugged away his opportunity to question me, yawning hugely. Lauren asked a surprisingly easy question about the Mender heresies, and I managed a quick and clever answer for him. I had to think for a long moment before answering Arwill's question about Lacilium. That left only Hem, who had been scowling furiously since I'd first stepped up to the master's table. My lackluster performance and slow answers had brought a smug curve to his lips by this point. His eyes gleamed whenever I gave a wrong answer. Well, well, he said, shuffling through the sheaf of papers in front of him. I didn't think we'd have to deal with your type of trouble again. He gave me an insincere smile. I'd heard you were dead. I heard you wear a red lace corset, I said matter-of-factly, but I don't believe every bit of nonsense that gets rumored about. Some shouting followed, and I was quickly brought up on charges of improper address of a master.
Wasn't it like $15
I was sentenced to compose a letter of apology and find a single silver talent. Money well spent.
Even play the game?
It was bad behavior, though, and poorly timed, especially after my otherwise lackluster performance. As a result, I was assigned a tuition of 24 talents. Needless to say, I was terribly embarrassed. Afterward, I returned to the bursar's office. I officially presented Alberon's letter of credit to Reem and unofficially collected my agreed-upon cut, half of everything over 10 talents. I put the 7 talents in my purse and wondered idly if anyone had ever been paid so well for insolence and ignorance. I headed to Anchor's, where I was pleased to discover no one had informed the owner of my death. The key to my room was somewhere at the bottom of the Sentha Sea, but Anchor had a spare. I went upstairs and felt myself relax at the familiar sight of the sloping ceiling and narrow bed. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. You might think my tiny room with its sloped ceiling and narrow bed would feel cramped after my grand suite in Alberon's estate. But nothing could be further from the truth. I busied myself unpacking my travel sack and getting cobwebs out of corners. After an hour, I'd managed to pick the lock on the trunk at the foot of my bed and unpack the things I'd stored away. I rediscovered my half-dismantled harmony clock and tinkered with it idly, trying to remember whether I'd been in the middle of taking it apart or putting it back together.
It used to cost money.
Then, since I had no other pressing engagements, I made my way back across the river. I stopped at the Aeolian, where Diok greeted me with an enthusiastic bear hug that lifted me from the ground. After so long on the road, so much time spent among strangers and enemies, I'd forgotten what it was like to be surrounded by the warmth of friendly faces. Diok, Stanchion, and I shared drinks and traded stories until it started to get dark outside, and I left them to tend to their business. I prowled the city for a while, going to a few familiar boarding houses and taverns. 2 or 3 public gardens, a bench beneath a tree in a courtyard. Diok told me he hadn't so much as glimpsed Denna's shadow in a year, but even looking for her and not finding her was comforting in a way. In some ways, that seemed to be the heart of our relationship. Later that night, I climbed onto mains and made my way through the familiar maze of chimneys and mismatched slate and clay and tin. I came around a corner and saw Ari sitting on a chimney, her long, fine hair floating around her head as if she were underwater. She was staring up at the moon and swinging her bare feet. I cleared my throat softly, and Ari turned to look. She hopped off the chimney and came scampering across the roof, pulling up a few steps short of me.
So you told me to just throw my caffeine.
Her grin was brighter than the moon. There is a whole family of hedgehogs living in Cricklet, she said excitedly.
World of Warcraft is so
Ari took 2 more steps and grabbed my hand with both of hers.
Graphics and everything
There are babies tiny as acorns. She tugged at me gently.
World of Warcraft
Will you
is
come
a
see?
banger game.
I nodded,
It's a banger.
and Ari led me across the
That's a
roof to the
banger
apple
game.
tree we could use to climb down into the courtyard.
But
When we finally got there, she looked at the tree, then down to where she still held my long, tan hand with both of her tiny white ones.
Dated. Like
Her grip wasn't tight, but it was firm, and she didn't give any sign of letting go. I missed you, she said softly without looking up. Don't go away again. I don't ever plan on leaving, I said gently. I have too much to do here. Ari tilted her head sideways to peek up at me through the cloud of her hair. Like visit me? Like visit you,
Thanks.
I agreed. Chapter 143, Bloodless. There was one final surprise waiting for me on my return to the university. I'd been back for a handful of days before I returned to my work in the fishery. While I was no longer in desperate need of money, I missed the work. There is something deeply satisfying in shaping something with your hands. Proper artificing is like a song made solid. It is an act of creation. So I went to Stocks, thinking to start with something simple, as I was out of practice. As I approached the window, I saw a familiar face. Hello, Basil, I said. What did you do to get stuck here this time? He looked down. Improper handling of reagents, he muttered. I laughed. That's not so bad.
Dude,
You'll be out in a span or so.
Everybody.
Yeah. He looked up and gave a shame-faced grin. I heard you were back. You come for your credit?
Sorry, Dustin.
I stopped halfway through my mental list of everything I'd need to make a heat funnel.
I think I have an hour
I
of
beg your
playtime.
pardon? Basil cocked his head to the side.
What's up, Luis?
Your
I think
credit,
I have an hour of
he
playtime
repeated.
in that game.
For
To
the
be fair.
bloodless. He looked at me for a
What's up,
moment.
Luis?
Then realization dawned on his
I
face.
just said hi to you twice. I don't know why.
That's right. You wouldn't know. He stepped
Yeah,
away from the
my
window for
character
a
was-
moment and
my
returned
character
with
was a
something that
baddie.
looked like an 8-sided lamp made entirely of
My
iron.
character was a baddie.
It was different than the arrow catch I'd made.
She had no
The one
business
I'd
being that
constructed
fine.
was built from scratch and rather rough around the edges. This one was smooth and sleek. All the pieces fit
Which means
together
you get zero
snugly,
tomorrow,
and it was
please.
covered in a thin layer
that
of
means.
clear alchemical enamel that would protect it from rain and rust.
Oh,
Clever.
wasn't it nice?
I should have included that in my original design.
I forgot.
While part of me was
So sweet.
flattered that someone had liked my design enough to copy it, a larger part of me was irritated to see an arrow catch so much more polished than my original. I noticed a telltale uniformity in the pieces. Someone made a set of moldings? I asked. Basil nodded. Oh, yes. Ages ago. 2 sets. He smiled. I've got to say, it's clever stuff. Took me a long while to get my head around how the inertial trigger worked, but
What's up, Drew?
now that I've got it, he tapped his forehead, I've made 2 myself. Good money for the time they take.
Who's
Beats
a
the
baddie?
hell out of
Oh,
deck
my Lost Ark
lamps.
character. My Lost Ark character was...
That wrung a smile out of me. Anything is better than deck lamps, I
Did I miss the
agreed,
dono? Did
picking
I?
it up. Is this one of yours?
I might have.
He
Hold
shook
up,
his
let
head.
me go look.
Mine sold a month back. They don't
Nice,
sit
thanks so much for
long.
the $10
Clever of you to
donation.
price them
I'm gonna
so
win this
low.
tournament. Of course.
I turned it over in my hands and saw a
Maybe I
word
did, I don't
grooved
know.
into the
I
metal.
don't think I did.
The blocky letters went deep
Definitely
into the
didn't say
iron,
thank you,
so I
so
knew
I
they
did.
were part of the mold. They
What I
read,
missed?
bloodless. I looked up at Basil.
Dono wall?
He smiled.
That was literally a dono wall. 'cause
You took
I-
off without
was
giving it a
dono.
proper name,
I didn't
he
see
said.
it.
Then Kilvin
Thanks so much for
formalized
the
the schema
$10
and added
donation.
it to the records.
Dude, Nice is
We
like-
needed to call it
Nice-
something
Nice
before
is
we
treating
started
me
to sell
nicely,
it.
Bro.
His smile faded a bit.
Nice
But
is so
that
nice.
was around the same time word came back you'd been lost at sea. So Kilvin brought in Master Elodin to give it a proper name, I said, still turning it in my hands. Of course. Kilvin grumbled a bit, Basil said. Called it dramatic nonsense, but it
Nice
stuck.
you took 'em up, that's what I'm saying.
He shrugged and ducked down and rummaged a
Nice-
bit
nice
before
having
bringing
fun,
up
by
a
the
book.
way.
Anyway, you want your credit?
I'm gonna get
He started
third-party
flipping
already. I
pages.
felt it.
You've got to have a chunk of it built up by now. Lot of folk have been making them. He found the page he
Oh
wanted
my
and ran his
God.
finger along the ledger line.
What is up with that gun?
There
and
we
why is
are.
everybody so
Sold
good with
28
it?
so far. Basil, I
That
said,
just hit me so
I really
far.
don't understand what you're talking about. Kilvin
Yes.
already paid me for the first one I made. Basil furrowed his brow. Your commission, he said matter-of-factly. Then, seeing my blank look, he continued. Every time stock sells something, the fishery gets a 30% commission, and whoever owns the schema gets 10%.
Yes, you do.
I thought stocks kept the whole 40, I said, shocked.
Sometimes I'm so smart.
He lifted one shoulder in a
When's the
shrug.
tournament? Tournament's in 4
Most times
hours.
it does. Stocks owns most of the old schemas. Most things have already been invented. But for something new... Manette never mentioned that, I said. Basil gave an apologetic grimace. Old Manette is a workhorse, he said politely. But he's not the most innovative fellow around. He's been here, 30 years? I don't think he has a single schema to his name. He flipped through the book a bit, scanning the pages. Most serious artificers have at least one just as a point of pride, even if it's something fairly useless. Numbers spun in my head. So, 10% of 8 talents each, I murmured, then looked up. I've got 22 talents waiting for me? Basil nodded, looking at the entry in the book. 22 and 4, he said, bringing out a pencil and a piece of paper. You want all of it? I grinned. When I set out for Imre, my purse was so heavy I feared I might develop a limp. I stopped by Anchor's and picked up my travel sack, resting it on my opposite shoulder to balance things out. I wandered through town, idly passing by all the places Denna and I had frequented in the past. I wondered where in the world she might be.
I need to land somewhere that's not...
After my ritual search was complete, I made my way to a back alley that smelled of rancid fat and climbed a set of narrow stairs. I knocked briskly on Davy's door, waited for a long minute, then knocked again, louder.
I've just been dying.
There was the sound of a bolt being thrown and a lock turning. The door cracked open and a single pale blue eye peered out at me. I grinned.
About to land on me.
The door swung open slowly. Davy stood in the doorway, staring blankly at me, her arms at her sides. I raised an eyebrow at her. What? I said. No witty banter? I don't do business on the landing, she said automatically. Her voice was absolutely without inflection. You'll have to come inside. I waited, but she didn't step out of the doorway. I could smell cinnamon and honey wafting out from the room behind her. Davy? I asked. Are you okay? She trailed off, still staring at me. Her voice was flat and emotionless. You're supposed to be dead. In this and many other things, I aim to disappoint, I said. I was sure he'd done it, Davy continued. His father's barony is called the Pirate Isles. I was sure he'd done it because we'd set fire to his rooms. I was the one that actually set the fire, but he couldn't know that. You were the only one he saw. You and that Sealdish fellow.
Oh.
Davy looked up at me, blinking in the light. The pixie-faced Gaelid had always been fair-skinned, but this was the first time I'd ever seen her look pale. You're taller, she said. I'd almost forgotten how tall you are. I almost forgot how pretty you are, I said, but I couldn't quite manage it. Davy continued to stand in the doorway, pale and staring. Concerned, I stepped forward and laid my hand lightly on her arm. She didn't pull away as I half expected. She simply looked down at my hand. I'm waiting for a quip here, I teased gently. You're usually quicker than this. I don't think I can match wits with you right now, she said. I never suspected you could match wits with me, I said. But I do like a little banter now and then. Davy gave a ghost of a smile, a little color coming back to her cheeks.
Dude, this guy's a demon.
You're a horse's ass, she said. That's more like it, I said encouragingly as I drew her out of the doorway into the bright autumn afternoon.
Because I feel like he
I knew you had it in you.
His gun out instantly.
The two of us walked to a nearby inn, and with the help of a short beer and long lunch, Davy recovered from the shock of seeing me alive. Soon, she was her usual sharp-tongued self again, and we bantered back and forth over mugs of spiced cider.
I honestly thought that he was
Afterward, we strolled back to her rooms behind the butcher shop, where Davy discovered she'd forgotten to lock her door. Merciful Taylu, she said once we were inside, looking around frantically. That's a first. Looking around, I saw that little had changed in her room since I'd last seen them, though her second set of bookshelves was almost half full. I looked over the titles as Davy searched the other rooms to make sure nothing was missing. Anything you'd like to borrow? She asked as she came back into the room. Actually, I said, I have something for you. I set my travel sack on her desk and rooted around until I found a flat rectangular package wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. I moved my travel sack onto the floor and put the package on the desk, nudging it toward her. Davy approached the desk wearing a dubious expression, then sat down and unwrapped the parcel. Inside was the copy of Selim Tincture I'd stolen from Caudicus's library. Not a particularly rare book, but a useful resource for an alchemist exiled from the archives. Not that I knew anything about alchemy, of course. Davy looked down at it. And what's this for? She asked. I laughed. It's a present. She eyed me narrowly. If you think this will get you an extension on your loan. I shook my head. I just thought you'd like it, I said. As for the loan, I brought out my purse and counted 9 thick talents onto her desk. Well then, Davy said, mildly surprised. It looks like someone had a profitable trip. She looked up at me. Are you sure you don't want to wait until after you've paid tuition? Already taken care of, I said. Davy made no move to take the money. I wouldn't want to leave you penniless at the start of the new term, she said. I hefted my purse in one hand. It clinked with a delightful fullness that was almost musical. Davy brought out a key and unlocked a drawer at the bottom of her desk. One by one, she brought out my copy of Rhetoric and Logic, my talent pipes, my sympathy lamp, and Denna's ring. She piled them neatly on her desk, but still didn't reach for the coins.
Then I'm dead.
You still have 2 months before your year and a day is up, she said. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to wait? Puzzled, I looked down at the money on the table, then around at Davy's rooms. Realization came to me like a flower unfurling in my head. This isn't about the money at all, is it? I said, amazed it had taken me this long to figure it out. Davy cocked her head to the side. I gestured at the bookshelves, the large velvet-curtained bed, at Davy herself. I'd never noticed before, but while her clothes weren't fancy, the cut and cloth were fine as any noble's. This doesn't have anything to do with money, I repeated. I looked at her books. Her collection had to be worth 500 talents if it was worth a penny. You use the money as bait. You lend it out to desperate folks who might be useful to you, then hope they can't pay you back. Your real business is favors. Davy chuckled a bit. Money is nice, she said, her eyes glittering. But the world is full of things that people would never sell. Favors and obligation are worth far, far more. I looked down at the 9 talents gleaming on her desk. You don't have a minimum loan amount, do you? I asked, already knowing the answer. You just told me that so I'd be forced to borrow more. You were hoping I'd dig myself a hole too deep and not be able to pay you back. Davy smiled brightly. Welcome to the game, she said as she began to pick up the coins. Thanks for playing. Chapter 144, Sword and Shade.
He's already in finals.
With my purse full to bursting and Alvaron's letter of credit assuring my tuition, my winter term was carefree as a walk in the garden. It was strange not having to live like a miser. I had clothes that fit me and could afford to have them laundered. I could have coffee or chocolate whenever I wanted. I no longer needed to toil endlessly in the fishery and could spend time tinkering simply to satisfy my curiosity or pursue projects simply for the joy of it.
Take these 1v3s.
After almost a year away, it took me a while to settle back into the university. It felt odd not wearing a sword after all this time, but such things were frowned on here, and I knew it would cause more trouble than it was worth. At first, I left Sosura in my rooms, but I knew better than anyone how easy it would be to break in and steal it. The drop bar would only keep away a very genteel thief. A more pragmatic one could simply break my window and be gone in less than a minute.
Too coordinated right now.
Since the sword was quite literally irreplaceable, and I'd made promises to keep it safe, it wasn't long before I moved it to a hiding place in the underthing. My shade was easier to keep at hand, as I was able to change its shape with a little work.
Oh, that's bad.
These days, it only rarely billowed on its own. More commonly, it refused to move as much as the gusting wind seemed to demand. You'd think people would notice such things, but they didn't. Even Willem and Simon, who teased me about my fondness for it, never marked my cloak as anything more than an exceptionally versatile piece of clothing. In fact, Elodin was the only one to notice anything out of the ordinary about it. "What's this?" he exclaimed when we crossed paths in a small courtyard outside Mainz.
Where'd this guy just
"How
go?
did you come to be in Shaden?"
Dude, he just shot me in the back
"I
and then
beg your
disappeared.
pardon?" I asked. "Your cloak, boy. Your turning cape. How in God's sweet grace did you tumble onto a shade?" He mistook my surprise for ignorance. "Don't you know what you're wearing?" "I know what it is," I said. "I'm just surprised that you do." He gave me an insulted look. "I wouldn't be much of a namer if I couldn't spot a fairy cloak a dozen feet away." He took a corner of it between his fingers. "Oh, that's just lovely. Here's a piece of old magic man rarely lays a finger on." "It's new magic, actually," I said. "What do you mean?" he asked. When it became obvious my explanation involved a long story, Elodin led us into a small, cozy pub I'd never seen before. I hesitate to call it a pub at all, actually. It wasn't full of chattering students and the smell of beer.
Dude,
It was
no way.
dim and quiet, with a low ceiling and scattered clusters of deep, comfortable chairs. Each smelled of leather and old wine. We sat near a warm radiator and sipped mulled cider while I told him the whole story of my unintentional trip
How
into
many
the
people
Fae.
are in here?
It was a wonderful relief. I hadn't been able to tell anyone yet for fear of being laughed out of the
How
university.
many people are pushing me? at the
Elodin
same
proved to be a
fucking time?
surprisingly attentive audience, and was especially interested in the fight Felurian and I had had when she had tried to bend me to her will.
Dude, what?
After I'd finished the story, he peppered me with questions. Could I remember what I'd said to call the wind? How had it felt? The strange wakefulness I described, was it more like being drunk, or more like going into shock? I answered as
Even
best I could,
1v7? I think
and
that was more
eventually
than a
he leaned
1v7.
back in his chair, nodding to himself. "It's a good sign when a student goes chasing the wind and catches it," he said approvingly. "That's twice you've called it now. It can only get easier." "3 times, actually," I said. "I found it again when I was off in Edemre."
I've been trying.
He laughed. "You chased it to the edge of the map," he said, making a broad motion with his splayed left hand. Stunned, I realized it was Adem hand talk for amazed respect. "How did it feel? Do you think you could find its name again if you had need of it?" I concentrated, trying to nudge my mind into spinning
I
leaf.
guess I just gotta win my 1v1
It had been a
faster.
month
I don't
and
know. I
1,000
gotta get
miles
better.
since I'd tried, and it was hard to tip my mind into that strange, tumbling emptiness. Eventually, I managed it. I looked around the small room, hoping to see the name of the wind like a familiar friend, but there was nothing there except dust motes swirling in a beam of sunlight
How to
that
take home the
slanted through a
tournament?
window.
I mean, Nyes literally told me to take it home.
Well?
I gotta
Elodin asked. "Could you call it if you needed to?" I hesitated. "Maybe." Elodin nodded as if he understood.
Yeah, I'm gonna play
"But
this
probably
tournament by
not if
myself.
someone were to
Fuck, I'm
ask
winning
you
this shit.
to.
Am I lonely?
I nodded, more than a little disappointed.
Dude.
"Don't be discouraged. It will give us something to work toward." He grinned happily and clapped me on the back. "But I think there's more to your story than you realize. You called more than the wind. From what you've said, I believe you
Dude,
called
there's 2 of them?
Felurian's name itself." I thought back.
Dude.
My memories of my time in the Fae were oddly
Why did it
patchy,
die so fast?
none more than my confrontation with Felurian, which had an
no way
odd,
that they're
almost
that close
dreamlike
together.
quality to it. When I tried to remember it in detail, it almost seemed as if it had happened to another person. "I suppose it's
Dude, they haven't
possible."
even announced ALGS yet.
"It's more than possible," he assured me. "I doubt a creature as old and powerful as Felurian could be subdued with nothing more than wind. Not to belittle your accomplishment.
Forgot that don't get
He
shot
hurried
part
to
yet,
add.
Apparently.
Calling the wind is more than one student in 1,000 ever manages, but calling the name of a living
I need to
thing,
listen to this song
let
again.
alone one of the Fae."
This song had me
He
fucking
raised
pumped
his
up.
eyebrows at me. "That's a horse of a different color."
Huh.
"Why would a person's name be so much different?" I asked, then answered my own question. "The complexity." "Exactly," he said. My understanding seemed to excite him. To name a thing, you must understand it entire. A stone or a piece of wind is difficult enough. A person? He trailed off significantly. I couldn't claim to understand Fomorian, I said. Some part of you did, he insisted. Your sleeping mind. A rare thing indeed. If you'd known how difficult it was, you never would have stood a chance of doing it. Since poverty no longer forced me to work endless hours in the fishery, I was free to study more broadly than ever before. I continued my usual classes in sympathy, medicine, and artificing, then added chemistry, herbology, and comparative female anatomy. My curiosity had been pricked by my encounter with the lockless box, and I attempted to learn something about Yillish story knots, but I quickly discovered most books on Yill were historical, not linguistic, and gave no information as to how I might actually read a knot. So I scoured the dead ledgers and discovered a single shelf of disused books concerning Yill in one of the unpleasant, low-ceilinged sections of the lower basements. Then, while looking for a place to sit and read, I discovered a small room tucked behind a piece of jutting shelving. It wasn't a reading hole as I suspected. Inside were hundreds of large wooden spools wound about with knotted string. They weren't books, precisely, but they were the Yillish equivalent. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and I doubted anyone had been in the room for decades. I have a vast weakness for secret things, but I quickly found that reading the knots was impossible without first understanding Yillish. There were no classes on the subject, and asking around revealed none of Master Linguist Gillers knew more than a scattering of words. I wasn't terribly surprised, considering Yill had been nearly ground to dust under the iron boots of the Aturan Empire. The piece that remained today was populated mostly by sheep, and if you stood in the middle of the country, you could throw a stone across the border. Still, it was a disappointing end to my search. Then, several days later, Master Linguist summoned me to his office. He'd heard that I'd been making inquiries, and he happened to speak Yillish rather well.
Too hot. Actually, yesterday was not hot at all. No, you didn't, because I know exactly what I wore yesterday. I wore a hoodie and sweatpants. I like how I just looted an entire, like, not an entire POI, but like a lot of a POI, and I didn't get a sight. Not a single one. Yesterday was actually raining. Yesterday was actually raining. I will admit that it was not hot yesterday. Yesterday was actually cold. I hear people. I just don't know what to do with that information. Dude. Just die, man.